probably the best time to start would be December 7th, 1941. I was assistant manager at the Waldorf Theater, and the manager that I worked for was seldom there, so I had most responsibility. And when I heard that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, immediately I had a question: what do I do? We have people there, we're showing a movie. Do I go in and tell them that the attack's been made, or do I say, since we've been attacked, we'll stop right now and you can all go home? And with all those decisions to make, I decided not to do anything. So that was the beginning, and I wanted to fly airplanes, and I did not have any college education, and none of the services, but the minimum requirement was 2 years of college.
How old were you?
So I was 19, and I checked with Marines and the Navy and the Army. At that time, the Army had the Air Force. It was all part of the Army, and not the Air Force wasn't a separate organization. And I even had some communication with the Royal Canadian Air Force. I had some thought of going up there, but that didn't work out. And then the Army was the first one that changed their wording of 2 years of college, or the equivalent. So the equivalent gave me the opportunity to take the examination to see whether I'd qualify that way, and I did. So I signed up and was having a physical. I was kind of heavy at that time. I think I weighed about 210 pounds, and I'd been trying to be on a diet for 2 or 3 months, and it wasn't working out too well. And when I took my physical, the flight surgeon who gave me the physical said, "You need to lose 30 pounds." And I thought, I've been trying to do that for 3 months and nothing's happened. But when I graduated from flying school, I weighed 180 pounds. And I went to pre-flight at Santa Ana in California, and life was a little different, I found, in the service than it had been as a civilian. And I think probably my worst day in the service was probably the second or third day that we were in Santa Ana, and I had KP. And as most of the movies show, the first thing I had to do was peel potatoes. And I wanted to go back home. But that obviously wasn't going to happen. And we were, I was in class 43B, which meant that we were the second class to graduate in 1943. And to stay on the schedule, I think our class had an extra 2 weeks in, maybe a little longer than that, in Santa Ana. And our first flying assignment was at Thunderbird Airport in Phoenix, Arizona. And we got there at the end of July, and it was hot. Fortunately, we were at, it was a civilian field, and we had civilian instructors, and all our barracks were air-conditioned. So that made it pretty nice, but the temperature in Phoenix in the summertime is hot and it's dry and it's miserable. And we had a physical training instructor there that was kind of a mean person. He was obviously in a lot better shape than any of us were, and he could do all the calisthenics twice as much as we could. And if somebody gets stressed with overheat and fall down, he'd just say, drag that man back to back, and we'd drag him back and we'd just continue. He was only there the first 4.5 weeks we were there. He left Phoenix to go to the Army, or to West Point, to train the football team. And I'm sure that they were well conditioned during the time that he was there. But it was a nice experience. We had, they still had the upper and lower class system in primary, that the upperclassmen hazed the underclassmen, and the only place that we were safe from hazing was in the mess hall. And an underclassman never stood at ease. You always had to stand at what we call parade rest. And that happened, we had to do that up until the time we stepped inside the door of the mess hall, and then we could be like everyone else. But they taught us military manners, I suppose. After you got your food, when you went to a table, you could go to any table you wanted, but you always had to ask permission to sit down. And you never hazed at mealtime. And we were flying learning how to fly called a Stearman PT-13, was the old blue and yellow, blue fuselage and yellow wing airplane with the open cockpit. The instructor sat in the front, you sat in the back, and we had to fly. The contract the military had with the civilian people was we had to fly 10 hours before we could solo. And I got my 10 hours in, and the instructor decided I could solo. And I was pretty happy about the whole thing. And I took off and got up about halfway around, and then a thought occurred to me, you're up there now, how are you going to get down? But it went well, and I thought I was doing pretty well. And I guess I think we had to have, I'm not sure now how many hours it was, but anyway, it was an exact number of hours we had to have. Not 1 minute less and not 1 minute more. And I think I had probably about 40 hours, and apparently I had done something that the instructor had a question about, and so he sent me up for a civilian check ride. Or I said civilian check ride. Well, I did a civilian check ride, and he recommended that I have a washout ride with the Army. The Army had the final say on whether it was washout or not. And I remember this man that was going to test me was the first lieutenant, and strictly formal. The word was with him that probably your check ride was going to last at least 45 minutes. And I got in the airplane and did all the things we were supposed to do and take off, and it went pretty well. And we went through several maneuvers and came back, and he said, okay, you can go back now. And the whole thing lasted about 22 or 23 minutes, I think. I thought, well, that must be it. And we went up and parked, and he got out of the airplane and didn't say a word. Went in, and I didn't know whether I was supposed to follow him or not, but anyway, I didn't. I'm standing out with the airplane, and then my civilian instructor came back, and he said, well, how'd you do? And I said, well, I don't have any idea. He didn't tell me. And he said, well, I'll go find out. And he came back and said, you passed. You're in fine shape. So that was really strange to me. It seemed the last check ride I had. And our first flying assignment was at Thunderbird Airport in Phoenix, Arizona. And we got there at the end of July, and it was hot. Fortunately, we were at, it was a civilian field, and we had civilian instructors, and all our barracks were air-conditioned. So that made it pretty nice, but the temperature in Phoenix in the summertime is hot and it's dry and it's miserable. And we had a physical training instructor there that was kind of a mean person. He was obviously in a lot better shape than any of us were, and he could do all the calisthenics twice as much as we could. And if somebody gets stressed with overheat and fall down, he'd just say, drag that man back to back, and we'd drag him back, and we'd just continue. He was only there the first 4.5 weeks we were there. He left Phoenix to go to the Army, or to West Point, to train the football team. And I'm sure that they were well conditioned during the time that he was there. But it was a nice experience. We had, they still had the upper and lower class system in primary, that the upperclassmen hazed the underclassmen, and the only place that we were safe from hazing was in the mess hall. And An underclassman never stood at ease. You always had to stand at what we call parade rest. And that happened, we had to do that up until the time we stepped inside the door of the mess hall, and then we could be like everyone else. But they taught us military manners, I suppose. After you got your food, when you went to a table, you could go to any table you wanted, but you always had to ask permission to sit down. And you never hazed at mealtime. And we were flying, learning how to fly called Sturman PT-13, was the old blue and yellow, blue fuselage and yellow wing airplane with the open cockpit. The instructor sat in the front, you sat in the back, and we had to fly. The contract the military had with the civilian people was we had to fly 10 hours before we could solo. And I got my 10 hours in, and the instructor decided I could solo. And I was pretty happy about the whole thing. And I took off and got up about halfway around, and then a thought occurred to me, you're up there now, how are you going to get down? But it went well, and I thought I was doing pretty well, and I guess I think we had to have, I'm not sure now how many hours it was, but anyway, it was an exact number of hours we had to have. Not 1 minute less and not 1 minute more. And I think I had probably about 40 hours, and apparently I had done something that the instructor had a question about, and so he sent me up for a civilian check ride. Or I said civilian check ride. Well, I did a civilian check ride, and he recommended that I have a washout ride with the Army. The Army had the final say on whether it was shot or not. And I remember this man that was going to test me, was the first lieutenant, and strictly formal. The word was with him that probably your check ride was going to last at least 45 minutes. And I got in the airplane and did all the things we were supposed to do and take off, and went pretty well. And we went through several maneuvers and came back, and he said, okay, you can go back now. And the whole thing lasted about 22 or 23 minutes, I think. I thought, wow, that must be it. And we went up and parked, and he got out of the airplane, didn't say a word, went in, and I didn't know whether I was supposed to follow him or not, but anyway, I didn't. I'm standing out of the airplane, and then my civilian instructor came back, and he said, well, how'd you do? And I said, well, I don't have any idea, he didn't tell me. And he said, well, I'll go find out. And he came back and said, you passed, you're in fine shape. So that was really strange to me. It seemed the last check ride I had, we went to Marana, Arizona, which is north of Tucson, and we were flying BT-13s there. A nice flying airplane. One thing I might say, well, a couple of things about Thunderbird I just thought about. One of the first things we did, I think there were about 360 of us in the class, and the Army base commander on a Saturday morning got us out on the ramp and lined us up in just a single line, and told us what the rules were and how he likes to see things happen. And he said, now I want you to take a look at the man on each side of you, because only one of you are going to leave here to go to basic. And that was rather surprised. I thought we'd be better off than that. But anyway, when I got to basic, we were the second class. This was a new field, and we were second class there. And the upperclassmen there weren't really too interested in hazing us any, so it was a pretty smooth thing. I had an instructor there, I know his name was Wood. I think I'll always remember him, because he always seemed to be tired. He'd take you up for duel, and you're supposed to have an hour's duel instruction. In about 20 minutes, he'd say, let's go back and land, and we'd go back and land, and he'd get out, and then we'd go back, and he was laying around on a wing of the airplane someplace, and then when I got back, he logged an hour's duel time when I only had 20, 30 minutes. But that was pretty well, and I hadn't had a check ride, and I asked him one day, when do I get my check ride? And he said, oh, I gave you that check right 2 weeks ago when we were flying formation. He wasn't even flying with me. I was flying formation, but he was the leader, and I was flying, two of us were flying formation on each wing. And he said, I gave you a check right that day. And, when I got to advanced, I went to twin engine advanced, and a fellow that lived right across the street from us, almost across the street, that's where I grew up on 82nd Street in Kansas City. His name was Richard White, and he had, I don't know, 4 brothers, I think. And he had a little problem with a juvenile, and a lady, J.C. Nichols, was a big developer in Kansas City, Missouri. And Mrs. Nichols got him from juvenile court and was kind of watching him, and I think gave him some opportunity to give him things that got him squared away and straightened out a little bit. And when I got to Marfa, Texas, the normal procedure for the Army, Air Force, you had to meet the base commander. And we were all standing there in a really big hangar, and the field commander was giving us our normal instructions. And I felt somebody tap me on the shoulder, and I looked, and it was Richard White. And he was a major then, and he was a safety officer at Marfa. And I was really embarrassed, number one, that he was talking to me, and number two, that he was talking to me while the base commander was talking to everybody else. But he apparently got along well there. I remember that he was, as a safety officer, he was doing a lot of things, and at graduation he was the one around taking all the pictures and probably doing things that was a little different than Army Air Force procedure. And he, prior to graduation, I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks, he called me one day and he said, what do you want to do when you leave here? And at that time, the B-26 was the hot airplane. I'd given some thought to being in the ferry command, and he said, just tell me what you want and I'll get it for you. And so I said, well, I'll take the B-26. And I did, and then after we graduated, my parents came to Marfa to see me graduate, and then I had a 10-day delay en route before I was going to Barksdale Field in Shreveport.
How long were you at Marfa?
I think it was 9 weeks.
And what planes were you flying while you were there?
They called it an A-10. No, it was an A-17. And it was a twin-engine airplane. And I don't know whether they still even have any of those left or not. But it was another thing that was at Marfa. We were there, in January and February. And in January it snowed. And I guess we had maybe a foot of snow on the ground, and all the natives around there said this is the first time we've had snow here in 20 years. But it only lasted a day, and it didn't interfere with anything, but that was rather an odd thing. The people around here, there was a little larger town, Marfa North, the big town. There was a little bigger town, I guess it's 15 or 20 miles away, called Alpine, and there was a girls' school in Alpine. But the people around there were really nice to the Air Force. They invited us sometimes on weekends. You get an invitation to go to somebody's house for dinner. It really worked out well. And then, of course, the big thing after you get your wings, one of the first things you do is go to the officers' club. That's the big thing then. And in our washout rate, the guy was right. About a third of us went to basic. And I think that, if I remember right, there were either 13 or 14 that was washed out in basic. And in advanced, there were 3 that didn't graduate, but that was a physical reason that they didn't graduate rather than their flying ability. And after that, after we graduated, I had 10 days later out, I came to Kansas City. And then I went to Shreveport. Friend and I had gone together, or I guess our last 2 years in high school, and then kind of off and on she left. I was a year ahead of her in school, and she left to go to Graceland. So I don't remember. I'm sure I saw her when I was home for the 10 days, but I don't remember particulars of that. And then I went to Barksdale, and that was standard Army training. We were our training ended at 26, which was not difficult, but it wasn't an easy airplane to fly. And Shreveport was a nice town. People there were very friendly, and we had lots of time. I say lots of time. We had to have permission or a pass to leave the base to go to Shreveport, but we always got out 2 or 3 nights a week to go to town and go in and walk around and go to a movie occasionally. And then from there we were assigned to cruise, and I was assigned as a co-pilot on my crew, and we went, flew our own airplane overseas. We went from Shreveport to, well, I guess they took us to, we were, flew on a transport airplane to Baltimore and picked up our airplane there. I always remember, and we got overseas equipment. They gave us a gun, and one of the co-pilots on one of the crew was in the airplane one day. He was just sitting, they were waiting to take off, and he was fiddling with his gun, and he shot the windshield out of the airplane, which was kind of a problem for him, but he got by with it all right. And then we went to, I remember we went up along the East Coast, and I suggested, so we didn't have gear, I wanted to know what, the last time, or where the boundary of the United States was, but we were going into Canada, we went up to Goose Bay. And when I was overseas, I figured my chances for survival were probably 50%. And so I thought I'd like a nice memory of when we left. And, well, the weather looked, or the country looked about like here when we went out up to Maine. And then we went across, we went to a place in Greenland called BW1. And we had a metal mat to land on there. And you landed going uphill and took off going downhill. The incline was 16%, and that was pretty steep. But, and we were only there a day and a half. The weather was pretty good for us. We had a little low weather when we got there, and you know, they had rivers up there, and what they call them, a fjord that came down. We flew up this fjord, but the clouds were high enough that we really didn't have any problem getting in and back out. And then we went to Greenland, and from Greenland we went to Scotland and landed there. Left the airplane there and took a train to London. And from London we went to our assignment, which was a place called Chipping-Ongar. It was outside of, trying to think of a big town that was north of there, Chatsworth or something like that. But we were about, I guess on the train took us about an hour to go from there to London. And we got, as far as time off, we were able to, I guess we'd leave the base probably once a week. And again, train ride to London was an hour. They had a very nice American Red Cross Club in London that supplied us food and lodging. They had cots there that we could go in and spend the night, and always had a table of food when you got back from going to the movie or something, or just walking around London. And we were, it was rather strange, a bunch of young guys, not too smart, going to a different country, and I think that, I'm sure that we irritated English people quite a bit, because we didn't really understand their ways, and the words and the language was a little different, and the meaning didn't come out quite the same. So sometimes there was a little friction, but generally everything went well. This was the time that the Luftwaffe was bombing London, and they did the whole thing at night. And I really felt sorry for the English people, because that was kind of a bad thing. I think one of the things that I thought was kind of affected me. I think one of the things that I thought was kind of affected me. One night there was an attack, and the sirens were going, and I went down. I don't remember where I was going, but I went down to the subway, and with the air raid on, I looked at all these women and children down in the subway, being down there for safety, and I thought, boy, misery, a sad thing. The Germans were dropping firebombs, and a lot of things were on fire, but I felt that you hate to see a family with the father gone and the mother trying to take care of the kids, and they're down here, have to spend half or all the night in a subway because it wasn't safe to be anyplace else. And generally, we flew, our bombing missions were somewhere between, depending, I'd say 3.5 to 5 hours. We always flew in a flight of 18. Our base always supplied 36 airplanes, but we flew as 2 18s. And they had, the normal procedure was, we'd go to briefing, and briefing was any time from 6 o'clock in the morning till afternoon. We'd go to briefing, and we'd find out where we're going, what our escort was going to be. The best escort we had, I thought, was a group that was made up of all Norwegians and Poles, and they were called, that was the first group RAF, and they were excellent flyers, and they flew Spitfires, and the Spitfire was really the best escort we had. And probably the worst escort we had was the American P-38. We didn't get P-51 escort very much, because we usually flew about 10 or 12,000 feet, and the 51s was higher than that. We either had usually P-47s or the Spitfires, and we preferred the Spitfire. Those guys were really good. You know, their field wasn't too far from ours, and usually, you know, the standard procedure then was when one of the fighter pilots shot down a German airplane, when he came back to his field, it was a low sweep across the field, and he'd pull up and do a slow roll, and then come back around and land. And occasionally they'd come over to our field and do that. But it was, I wouldn't say a pleasant experience, but it's always nice to, when you got back, and see somebody else come back. The other one got there. One of the kind of sad things, one of the things that usually when the group came back from overseas, or from a mission, the whole 36 flew across the field to start the landing procedure. And when we heard him come, if you didn't fly that day, you hear him coming back, you always went out to look to see whether there was 36 airplanes or not. But I flew 73 missions.
What was the range of the B-26? How long were your flights?
Oh, depending, somewhere between 3, 4.5, 5 hours. The bomb load that we had was 2,000 pounds, and depending on the target would depend on what kind of bombs we had. Well, at the end, about the only thing we were bombing was, the Germans had a thing, I think they called it V1, that was unmanned. Really, it was a flying bomb, it was unmanned, and we were bombing the launch sites for those. And before that, our targets were airports, power stations, and munitions factories, if they knew where they were. Electrical places. I remember one time we were, I don't know where, but we went to France to bomb a power station on a river. And we came back with strike pictures, and it was perfect. That thing was destroyed. And to find out a little later, it wasn't destroyed at all. They had built a fake on one side of the river, and the real plant was on the other side of the river. And we got good results on the fake plant. And I always remember the first flight base commander that we had, his name was Story. And he was old-time Air Force person, but really a great guy. For a while our food wasn't too good, and so he asked the supply officer one day, what can you do to improve our quality of our food and quantity? And he said, well, I just have to report that we have more men than we do. And so Colonel Story said, you do that. And we ate good for about 6 weeks, and somebody found out what was going on. And from then, for a while, we had to suffer for that. And I don't know, he was transferred right after that, and I don't know whether that was the reason that they transferred him or not. But I guess when he found out that we had bombed the wrong thing, I guess he had requested from Wing that when they go back, he wanted to go. But again, that request wasn't granted, and we didn't get to go back. I think some of the toughest places that we went, there was the airport in Holland, now I can't think of the name of it, was well defended, both with anti-aircraft and fighters, and we were there 2 or 3 times, and we lost some airplanes there. And finally, usually the target on an Air Force base was intersection runways or the hangars. And that was the same thing at this airport, and I think the 3rd time we went, somebody smartened up and did some research, and they found out that the airport was below sea level. And instead of bombing the normal things, they got the pumps that were keeping the water out. And that closed the airport for a while. That was one of the best successes that we had.
So how long were you over in Europe, overseas?
13 months. We went overseas in, I think it was the end of September.
What year?
In '43. I graduated in February, and then I was originally, as I said, we were at this place called Chickamauga that was an airfield that was built just for the war airplanes. And then prior to, well, it was after D-Day, we moved down to an airfield, and I don't remember call the name of it right now. It was about halfway between Bournemouth and Southampton in southern England. And I was only there maybe 6 weeks before I came home. But I was there, I was overseas for 13 months. But it was, I remember one day, one of the trips we were there, the lead airplane, we flew in flights of 6. One flight was up here, one here, and one down here, and another over here. And we were flying on the right, we were in the 6 on the right side, but the lead airplane right in front of us took an aircraft shell right in the wheel well of one engine, and they were really kind of having difficulty, and they dropped out of formation, and so we didn't have a fighter escort that day because the airport wasn't that deep, but we dropped out with them, and we thought they're really not going to make it. So we dropped out with them, so at least we hoped their navigator could have a good enough spot that the air sea thing could rescue them. But they got the airplane through back and they bellied in on the beach in England. But from looking at the airplane, I don't know how they kept together that long to get that far back.
Was your plane ever hit?
Yeah, we had, one time we came back with enough damage that we were losing oil in one engine, and when we landed, that was the last of our oil, and the airplane had so many holes and had enough damage that they didn't even try to make any effort to us. They just salvaged it, and that was all. And we occasionally got, I say occasionally, several times, we got one time that we had anti-aircraft people told us that when a shell exploded, it kind of exploded in a V like that, rather than, you visualize the thing just being in a circle. Well, according to them, that wasn't the way the anti-aircraft shell exactly exploded. And we got hit one day that the explosion was right between the two seats, and the anti-aircraft people said, well, you made it through that because that V that day was like that, so that the force of the explosion was front and back between you. And I guess it was because we had pretty bad damage from that. Of course, one of the things that was kind of difficult in B-26, we had to bail out. It wasn't the best way to get out. You had to, there was an opening where the nose wheel door folded up, that there was a door there that you could open and drop down through there, or else go back and drop out to Bombay. And that wasn't really the best thing, but there's bad things about everything, I guess.
When that shell went between your seats, were you injured?
No. No, I can't remember the name of the instrument that it hit. Had something to do with the electrical system. No, neither one of us were bothered. One of the things that we wore what they call a flak jacket that was, well, today I guess it's about the same thing as a bulletproof vest that just covers your body. But jacket was never hit, or that I had any injuries at all. One of the original members of our crew was a waist gunner, and he was killed one day and was flying with another crew. And other than that, none of our people were ever hurt.
Which unit were you in? What Air Force? What unit?
We started out in the 3rd Air Force, and the 9th Air Force was in Italy, and then they transferred the 9th Air Force to to England, and they moved us from the 3rd to the 9th. The 3rd was mostly heavy bombers, and the 9th was medium. So, really, I suppose at my time overseas, I probably only in the 3rd Air Force. Well, maybe 3 months. The rest of the time was 9th Air Force.
Remember your unit numbers?
No. No, I don't. I remember my serial number, but I don't remember the group or the squadron that we were in.
You always see pictures of the World War II planes, and they were all named and had fancy nose art. Did your planes have anything like that?
Yeah, ours, not my choice, was called the Black Fury, and that was by vote of the crew, and I'm not sure what the significance of that was. Somebody in the crew had some idea for that, but I don't remember what it was.
What did they have painted on the nose?
I think Black Fury was the only thing. I don't think we had any picture or anything.
Just in lettering.
Yeah.
And you flew several planes, or as time went by, you flew different aircraft?
Well, when we first got overseas, you never knew what airplane you were going to fly, and
So you ferried planes over, but those weren't the ones that you stayed with?
no.
Okay.
The one that we flew over, I don't know what happened to it. They was just assigned someplace, and everybody that was coming over was bringing an airplane. But I really don't remember that we ever had a crew that brought an airplane to the airbase. I think everybody landed in Scotland, and then I can't remember now whether we had, I guess the airplanes, we were there a while before they mounted 50 millimeter machine guns on the side of the aircraft that we could fire forward, but I don't know. We couldn't hit anything even if we had something to shoot at.
And that was for anti-aircraft purposes or for strafing the ground?
No, we weren't strafers. I think the lowest mission we flew was D-Day, and the instructions that day was do what you have to do that you can see the target and hit it. And I think we were about 2,500 feet. We did have some bad experience with some bombing problems, not only our group, but everybody. I think there was a place called, I think it was St. Lo in France, that the ground forces were having a pretty tough struggle, and so the assignment was to do a blanket bombing up around where the front line was. And something went wrong with either they had bad information on the wind or whatever it was, but anyway, the wind blew in the opposite direction we thought it was going to, and we were dropping bombs on the American troops rather than the Germans. But I don't know really how bad it was, but there was a mistake made. And, some kind of have some amusing things. Uh, the British had an airplane that was twin-engine airplane, pretty slick-looking airplane. The landing gear folded back into the wheel wells, and there was hot shots with the RAF that flew that airplane. And it was a medium bomber, a little smaller than the B-20, well, quite a bit smaller than B-26.
Mosquito?
What?
The Mosquito?
Well, it might have been, I don't remember. Anyway, they, you see that thing take off, and hot rocks would not lift off the ground, they just blow the wheels up, and they were still 2 feet when the wheels were going up. But anyway, in B-26, we had a tail gunner that had 2 50mm machine guns, and we had a turret gunner that sat right over the navigator's compartment that he fired out of the top of the airplane. And the waist gunner had 1 50mm on each side that flew out. He stood on a catwalk. And one of the guys in our group came back one day and they had shot down a German airplane. And all the visual reports from our group that we gave to security was, I wasn't involved in, but anyway, this gunner shot down an airplane. He was, that night they were having a big celebration at the non-commissioned officers club. This guy shot down an airplane, and come to find out it wasn't a German airplane at all, it was an RAF airplane. But luckily, none of the crew made it back safely. Greetings. And other than losing the airplane, the RAF people weren't too upset. But
Nobody was injured?
no,
That's lucky.
luckily.
What was your most vivid memory of your time overseas?
Oh, probably the destruction in London. And of course, I was a young guy, and I wasn't too concerned. I didn't have any problem being out of the air raid shelters when the RAF was or when the Luftwaffe was coming over, but I really felt badly for the people, as I said, that were in the subway, and you'd see fires burning, people, their house was being burned up while they were trying to save themselves in a shelter someplace. And that was kind of bad. One of the things I remember that, from not vivid, but in England then, the old double-decker bus was the main part of transportation in town. And I remember coming out of a show one night when the fog was so thick that you really couldn't see anything. And this double-decker bus, there was a guy holding a torch, walking along in front of the bus with 1 foot on the curb and 1 foot in the street. And the bus was just falling along. And I don't know how they ever got any place, but it was interesting to see.
So when was it that you came back to the United States from Europe?
Well, let's see, I came back in, we were married in 44, so I must have came back. I came back in 44, end of August.
The war was still going on,
Yeah.
and you were sent back,
Yeah.
huh? Because you'd flown the right number of missions? Or?
Well, we really didn't have the right number of missions. When the B-24s and B-25 pods, or crews, had 25 missions. Well, ours was supposed to be 50. And I think that we might have had 2 or 3 crews that flew 50 missions that came back, and we were getting several more that were due to come back, and they said 50 doesn't count anymore. You'll be relieved when have replacements for you. So, I really don't know if, I don't think there are many medium palm or medium people that I don't think got the 80. But it's just like everything else, sometimes it doesn't go according to plan, and some of the people that came over were poorly trained. I remember B-26 has a strange fuel system that we couldn't transfer fuel. The flight engineer had to transfer fuel, and that was done back at the bulkhead between the bomb, where we carried the bombs, and the airplane. And we had a guy that lived in our barracks, was a school teacher, and he was from Ohio, I think, and he complained about everything. And nothing was right, and I don't think that he found anything about the whole operation that he couldn't complain about. And he had, they sent in some new flight engineers, and for some reason he got one of the new flight engineers. And the first day that he flew, the new flight engineer with their crew, our normal procedure was that when we got to the shoreline in England and went out over the channel, the engineer would transfer fuel to from the auxiliary to the main tank. And this guy, I can't think of his name, but anyway, he had a new co-pilot and a new flight engineer. And they got to channel, and he called the flight engineer and said, start transferring fuel. And the flight engineer said, I don't know how. So he said, all right, I'll come back and do it. And he told the co-pilot, you fly. And the co-pilot said, I've never flown formation before. So here this guy is, the engineer can't transfer fuel, and the co-pilot can't fly formation. Which is funny now, but it wasn't very funny to him. But anyway, he pulled out of formation a bit and told the co-pilot, just keep him in sight. And he went back and transferred fuel, and they made it right. But he really complained when that happened to him, and probably justly so.
Probably so. What else I can ask you about? You said in Florida you were flying A-26s. Those were the attack planes?
They were more so than the B-26. They were a faster airplane. Didn't carry as much bomb load, but they were basically a replacement for the B-26. You know, the B-26, the one that I flew, was made by Martin, and it had a short wingspan. Mm-hmm. In fact, you know, one of the names for the airplane was the Flying Prostitute, because it didn't have any visible means of support. But they changed it. One of the problems with the original 26 that I flew all the time, was it always appeared to be flying with the nose a little elevated. And they corrected that, and I think, if I remember right, the new one that they changed the dihedral on the wing so that the nose of the airplane was down. But when they did that, they reduced the speed by, I think 515 miles an hour. And even though the old one was more difficult to fly, and if you lost an engine on the original model of the airplane, you couldn't hold it with the rudder. You had to run frame. You couldn't hold it with your foot. And with the new one, that wasn't that much of a problem. But it's the slow speed, 10 or 15 miles an hour doesn't seem very much, but it seems a lot when you're up there and having all those black explosions around you. the fighters making a pass at you. But that was one thing that, from the time I started over there, when we had a fighter attack that they were able to get through our escort and get to us, new Luftwaffe pods, and we had, either the, I think the airplane was a 109. Anyway, those guys were out there and they would just come right at you. Where later, before I came home, we could see them out there and they were just kind of waiting, and I don't know why, and then they just leave. And not because we had an escort particularly, but they just fly around out there and you could see them and they'd go someplace else. Where originally when I go overseas, when you see them out there, you knew that if they got through our fighter escort, we were going to have a problem. And we had, when we had fighter escort, we didn't always have it. Sometimes we went without it. But when we did, we always had that exchange. We'd have a group to go in with us, but couldn't stay long enough to come back with us. So the one group would take us as far as they could go, and then the other group would come somewhere close to that to pick us up to come back out. But generally, I think that I don't know whether the desire of the German pilots wasn't as great as it was or what, but in the beginning it was a lot tougher than it was at the end.
That's about it, I guess. I don't have any other questions.
But, and one of the things they do, they had, the Germans had an airplane that was similar to our P-47, and they would be out there and they'd come in toward you, and then when they got in firing range, they'd start to roll, and they had armor plating on the bottom, so that when they rolled, even if our gunners were lucky enough to hit them, they were hitting that armor plating right in the airplane.
Wow. Was that a single engine plane or a twin engine plane?
Single.
You said the P-38s weren't good escorts. Why? Those were the Lightnings, right? The twin engine P-38s?
Yeah, twin engine.
And why weren't they good escorts?
Well, I think probably because, and I don't know what limitations the airplane had because of the pilot's experience. For some reason, and maybe I'm criticizing the P-38s when it really wasn't their fault, but of the escort we had, as far as we were concerned, the P-38 would be our last choice. 47s also seemed to be good, and the Hurricane from the RAF we occasionally had weren't the greatest either. But of course I think that, of course I've always been an admirer of Churchill, and I think that when he said that never has so much been owed by so many to so few, when he was talking about the RAF and the Spitfires, was really a true statement. And I obviously never saw it happen, but they say that toward the end of the war, when the Germans were firing those V-1s at London, they say that some of the RAF pilots would go up and, instead of shooting the thing down, they'd just go up and lift their wing up and tip it a little bit, and they'd throw the gyro off and the thing would just spin and go down. I've heard that they did that. I have my doubts about it, but that's what they say.
I've heard a lot about that too. So what I'm going to try and do is get on the internet and find pictures. And you mentioned D-Day. Where were you flying on in that period? Where did they have you assigned?
The day of D-Day, we flew in the afternoon, and the target, usually uh, on our bombing missions, I said we flew between 10 and 12,000 feet, and if we had to go for any reason below that, normally the mission was scrubbed. For example, the cloud cover was got worse below than they anticipated, we'd go back. But when we went on D-Day, I didn't know that there were that many ships in the world that was in the channel out there that day. And we bombed a railroad junction that the Germans, the intelligence thought that they were bringing tanks to back up the front line on this train, and we bombed a switch crossing to stop that train, and I guess we did. I don't know. I didn't see the train, but that was not a pleasant sight. There was, remember seeing one of the Navy ships, and I don't know which was fore and aft or front or back as far as the airplane was, or the boat was concerned, but one end of it was sinking in the water and they were still firing out. The other end, it was up in the air. And they had warships and things of it than I knew existed. One of the other things I thought was rather strange, I think it was 2 days before D-Day, and of course we all knew obviously something was going to happen, but we got the order that nobody leaves the base, and anybody that was on leave or had gone to London or had a couple of days off that left the base, they couldn't come back on. There was the MPs and the ground forces were stationed completely around the base. No one left, no one come in. And I really didn't understand why the people coming back couldn't come on, but that was the rule. They said, and I don't know what they told the people when they come back and they couldn't get on the base. I don't know where they went or what they told them to do. But I ended up, that was being a check pot. We had a period of time there that, as you hear stories, the Air Force or the Army Air Force messed up a little bit, and some of the crews that they were sending over really hadn't been properly trained to be there. And so I was flying with them to try to get everything smoothed out, and sometimes it was difficult. I remember the first mission I flew that way, our procedure was the lead airplane always was a guy that had the bomb sight, and when they opened their bomb doors, everybody else did too, and when they dropped, we dropped. And I remember this one day, as I said, it was the first mission that I've only been checked by. We were up the target and opened the bomb doors, and I don't know what happened. It was kind of cloudy that day, and there's a little cloud cover beneath us, and I guess that apparently the bombardier decided that it wasn't best to drop any, didn't drop his bombs, and the doors started to close, and I heard our bombardier say, "Bombs away." He apparently thought he wasn't watching when he saw the other bomb doors start to drop. He thought everybody else had dropped, and so he did. So we, out of 36 airplanes, I was the only one that dropped any bombs. I don't know how bad, what the damage was, but that's part of the errors you make in wartime, I guess. And from there, when I came back from overseas, at that time, Francis was at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, and prior to that time, I guess that I'd written my mother and asked her to pick out an engagement ring, and I had her give it to Fran for me, and Fran accepted. So when I came back, she was at Beth Israel, and I landed at Prescott, Maine. We were flown back on a DC-4 and landed in Prescott, and then I went from, I can't remember whether I had to go any place before I went to Kansas City or not. Anyway, one of the things, when I was overseas, sometimes the food wasn't as good as we'd like for it to be. And I envisioned a hamburger with all the things that we put on them. And when I got in Presque Isle, I think I went to rode a train to Bangor, Maine, and I had, I think, about 45 minutes lay over there to get on another train. And when I was stationed, and there was a sign down the street a little way that said restaurant. And I thought, boy, now's my chance to get a hamburger. And I went down there and envisioned something that was a bun with a hamburger and lettuce and onions and pickles. And the hamburger I got was a piece of meat between two slices of bread, and that was all. But I went on to, I went to St. Louis and then to Kansas City. And when I got to Boston, I did have, I think I had a layover about 3 hours, and I went to Beth Israel and saw Fran. And then when I got to Kansas City, she had arranged for time off for her, and she came to Kansas City, and we were married. I think she called her mother and said, plan for a wedding in 2 days. So we had a little time together, and she went back to Beth Israel. And jets were the big thing as far as my assignment was concerned then. I'd asked to fly a jet, but there wasn't any openings, but I was assigned to go to Marianna, Florida, and fly what they called then an A-26. They call it a B-26 now, and they're not even, I don't think there's any of those anymore. And I was there for, I don't remember how long. And we had talked about not even serious consideration of staying in the service. And, one of the things that they thought that if you wanted to stay in, you need to have an administrative job. And I had, my first administrative job was a supply officer, which wasn't the most glamorous thing in the service. But the Air Force, being as generous as they were with decorations, when they decided that they were going to have people discharged, you had to have so many points to be discharged, and I had enough points from decorations to be discharged without counting my service time. And I don't know really what happened, but I guess that I must have gotten tired of the routine or something, and we decided that maybe best to be discharged and be out of the service. However, I was commissioned in the reserve, and when instead of being discharged, I was relieved from active duty. And paper-wise, I've never really been, I don't have a discharge from the Air Force. I just have relief from active duty. And we went to, I was relieved at Maxwell Field in Montgomery. I remember when I was home, when we came back from overseas, I bought a Buick, I think it was a 38 Buick or something like that. We had, and when we left Marianna to go to Montgomery, the clutch went out of the Buick, and I don't quite know how we did it, but we drove all the way from Marianna to Montgomery without a clutch. And
I trust you stopped a few times.
Yes, yes. And then we came home, or back to Kansas City. Well, prior to that, when Fran went back to Boston and I went to Florida, that didn't work out too well. And we were married in September, and I think that she decided to give up her internship there. And I think she came to Florida in probably November. So that was the beginning of a long and happy married life. Beyond that, well, when we came back to Kansas City, Fran's dad owned a grocery store, and I went to work for him in the grocery store, and that wasn't really probably the thing for me. And then I heard about, in the meantime, I decided I'd try to do some more flying, and I went to, got my twin engine commercial rating, and I'd heard about a company called North American Airlines that was based in Kansas City. It was a non-scheduled airline that theoretically, I say theoretically, they couldn't advertise as a non-scheduled airline. They couldn't advertise the scheduled time that they would leave. The only thing that they were supposed to do was say, we have a flight going from Kansas City to New York. Then we flew the schedule the same as the scheduled airlines did. And I was flying from Kansas City to Chicago and then New York. And occasionally when I was in New York, there'd be something come up that North American flew from Burbank to Kansas City, Chicago to New York, and they had New York to Miami. And occasionally I'd get a trip and go from New York to Miami. And that was always pretty nice, particularly in the wintertime, and leave New York, no dirty snow was there, and get to Miami and it'd be 70 degrees. But North American had a couple problems that I was a little concerned about. I can't remember the senator's name now, but he was chairman of the Small Business Committee, and North American was a small business, and he, I don't know what the association was, but he was favorable to North American. And as they were getting a little bigger, and then they decided that they were going to eliminate Kansas City as a stop on a crew base. So we could have gone to either Burbank or New York, and I had some concern. That senator's name was Sparkman, and I had some concern of what would happen to North American if Sparkman wasn't reelected sometime. So I decided that maybe since we were in Kansas City, that'd be a good place to stay. And so when they moved to crew base, I resigned and didn't change. However, North American continued well, and they merged with some other airlines, and during the Korean thing, when the services were contracting a lot of flying out to other airlines, North American Airlines did pretty well. I think they stayed in it for some time. They moved from propeller airplanes to jets, and they were hauling cargo as well as passengers. But I haven't had, or didn't have really any further contact with any of the people at North American. However, I did, one of the pilots at North American, name was Hall, and he lived in Kansas City, and he stayed with North American for some time after that, but then I think he stopped and he had some kind of flying service out of Kansas City. And I never really had any contact with the North American people after I left. Beyond that, I think the rest is history, so to speak.